You're forgiven.
Shall we go to dinner?
Hi, welcome back to English Recaps. Today I'm going to explain comedy romance film called Pretty Women Watch Out, and subscribe this channel for movies. A man called Edward Lewis is on the telephone with his sweetheart Jessica at a party. She lets him know she's talking more to his secretary than to himself and that she's parting ways with him. While leaving, he meets a lady who's recently married, inquiring as to whether she talked more to his secretary than him when they were dating. And she answers his secretary was one of her bridesmaids outside.
He's leaving. Edward's leaving.
Edward requests that his legal counselor Philip get his vehicle. Philip gets stressed his vehicle will get harmed since Edward is a terrible driver, yet hesitantly concurs. That night a lady called Vivian is awakening and starts planning to go out. As she is done and is going to leave, she sees her landowner in the flight of stairs and chooses to return into the condo. She goes to select cash for lease, however just sees a minimal expenditure left, and on second thought leaves through the window. She goes to a close-by bar and goes dependent upon her companion called Pack and inquires as to whether all the cash is gone. Unit answers she involved some for a party, and Vivian answers she can't completely accept that she took their lease cash while she was sleeping and bought stuff with it. Meanwhile, Edward arrives in the city asking a poor man how to get to Beverly Hills, and the man replies he's already there. Kid and Vivian are talking on the street as a man driving by asks for a freebie since it's his birthday, and Kit tells him to dream on. Suddenly the two see a Lotus Esprit stopping, and Kit tells Vivian she should go for him and not take less than $100. She goes up to the window and asks if he wants a date, but he says he just wants directions to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Vivian says she can help him for $10 first. He thinks she's ridiculous but agrees he only has a $20 bill, however, and Vivian insists to show him personally for that amount. As they begin to drive, she tells him he's forgot to turn on the lights on the car. Edward asks for her name, and she playfully teases him asking what he wants it to be, but then tells him it's Vivian. She starts asking about the car and comments it must corner like it's on rails, but Edward doesn't know what that means, knowing nothing of cars. Suddenly he asks if she's ever driven a Lotus, which she hasn't, and Edward says she will do it right now. Vivian tells him to fasten his seatbelt and shows him what the car really can do. He asks how much money them girls earn these days, and Vivian says they can't take less than $100. Edward thinks she meant 100 a night, but she clarifies it's an hour. Edward comments that it's stiff, but Vivian playfully interprets what he said differently and starts touching him, responding no, but it has potential. They arrive and Vivian says she'll grab a cab back, and the two bid each other goodbye. Edward, however, walks back up to her saying he'd be very pleased if she could accompany him into the hotel. She gladly follows him and asks his name. He says Edward, and she jokes Edward as her favorite name in the whole world. They walk into the hotel and Vivian gets his jacket since the hotel requires appropriate clothing. Edward arranges a few champagne and strawberries to the room. As they get to the lift, Vivian acts in a provocative way, and a lady advises her significant other to close his mouth. They get to the penthouse, and she keeps acting coquettish. She thinks the condo is astonishing, saying it has a phenomenal view. Edward says he's frightened of levels and never goes out there yet believes her. Vivian asks how he will manage her now that she's there, and he answers he doesn't be aware since he didn't arrange for this. She says he can pay her meanwhile to perhaps loosen things up. Vivian then gets a few tones and requests that he pick which one he needs. Edward then says he simply needs to talk a little, thus they start to talk. Unexpectedly the doorbell rings, and Vivian races to open it. The man has brought the champagne and strawberries, and Edward gives him a tip. Vivian inquires as to whether he has a spouse or sweetheart, and Edward says he is both. She asks how that functions, and Edward answers his ex lives with his ex K9 in his ex home, and his ex Jessica is moving out as they speak. Vivian sees he's not drinking and inquires as to whether he will, and Edward answers he doesn't drink. She remarks she prefers his tempting scene, yet expresses she's on an hourly rate and inquires as to whether they can move it along. Edward detects her time issue is a significant issue for herself and asks how much for the entire night. Vivian says he can't bear the cost of it, yet he demands. She says $300, and Edward says bargain. Not long after, Vivian fixes something in the restroom. As Edward strolls in on her, she conceals something, and Edward says he doesn't need unlawful stuff in there. While she makes sense of she doesn't do unlawful stuff, he sees it's dental floss, and she makes sense of it's for the strawberry seeds. Later, Edward is chipping away at the telephone as Vivian sits in front of the television. She requests that he join her cookout, yet Edward declines. Vivian, not long after, sees Edward is watching her eagerly and she starts stripping down for him. She draws near to him and asks what he needs, and Edward asks back what she does, and she answers. She does everything except kissing on the mouth, and Edward says he doesn't either. Next, Edward is taking a shower and soon after goes back into the bedroom and sees Vivian with her real hair. It's early morning and Edward is on the phone with Philip, and they know to Mr. Morse is going to fight for his company. Edward then tells Philip his car corners like it's on rails, and Philip, not knowing what it means, gets worried and Edward hangs up. Edward offers Vivian breakfast, having ordered everything on the menu. She asks what he does and he explains he buys companies in financial difficulty. She says he must get them for a bargain price then, and Edward explains he's buying one company right now for the bargain price of $1 billion. While she helps him tie his tie, she asks what he does after buying the companies, and he says he breaks them up into pieces and sells the pieces for more than the whole. Not long after, Philip explains Mr. Morse's grandson will join him for dinner and says he should likely get somebody to go along with him too. Unexpectedly, Edward hears Vivian singing and hangs up on Philip. He makes sense of for Vivian that he has a strategic plan to recruit her to remain with him for 7 days. She answers energetically that assuming that it's 24 hours daily, it will cost him. Edward asks how much, and Vivian says $4,000. Edward arranges saying $2,000, and Vivian promptly counters with $3,000, and Edward says done. She gets absolutely elated. Edward gives her some cash and makes sense of they will go out in the nights, and believes her should purchase something exquisite to wear, not excessively hot. As he has left, she shouts of delight and bliss. She calls Kid and clarifies for her about Edward and that she will get $3,000 along with additional cash for garments, and youngster is really desirous. Vivian says she will leave some cash for her in the gathering and requests that she drop by next. Vivian leaves a letter with cash in the gathering, and an inn supervisor inquires as to whether she's seen Vivian before. Vivian strolls around among the costly stores and feels large and in charge. She strolls into a shop, yet the retail laborers tell her the garments won't accommodate her and that they are excessively costly for her. Vivian says she has cash to spend, however, at that point they advise her to escape their store. She is unsettled and strolls back to the inn. As she gets back, the lodging chief stops her and requests that she follow him to his office. Presenting himself as Mr. Thompson, he makes sense of Edward is an exceptionally unique client and that they will disregard who he brings as visitors. He then asks who she is to Edward, and she answers she's his niece. Mr. Thompson then inquires as to whether he will at any point see her at the inn again after Edward leaves. Since she definitely can't have different uncles at the inn, she answers he will not, and the two have a comprehension. As he advises her to dress all the more safely, Vivian lets him know fairly disheartened she attempted to purchase garments, yet nobody would help her. He lifts the telephone and Vivian gets scared. He will call the police, but then Thompson starts talking with a woman in a nearby boutique asking for a favor and says he's sending over a very special guest. Next up, Vivian meets a woman who's called Bridget, who's very sweet and helps her. Meanwhile, in an office, Edward and his partners make a plan to buy Morse's company, after which Edward leaves. Philip asks about the woman who sang on the phone, but Edward says it's nobody he knows. Suddenly, Vivian thanks Thompson in the lobby for helping him, saying he's cool. As she gets back to the room, the phone rings, and it's Edward jokingly saying she should never pick up the phone. He tells her to meet him in the lobby later, and they hang up. Edward calls back immediately and reminds her not to pick up the phone, and they laugh. Soon after, she asks Thompson for help. He helps her learn dining etiquette, but she's finding it a bit hard to remember what all the forks and knives are for. Later, Edward returns to the hotel but doesn't see Vivian. Mr. Thompson appears, telling him he has a message from his niece that she's waiting for him in the lounge. Edward says they both know she's not his niece, but thanks him in the lounge. Edward first misses her and is surprised how sophisticated she looks, saying she's stunning. They go to a fancy restaurant and meet Mr. Morse and his grandson David, and Edward introduces Vivian. Later, Vivian struggles with what fork to use, and Mr. Morse tells her he himself has never been able to figure which goes with what. Later, Mr. Morse asks Edward what he intends to do with his company if he buys it, and Edward says he will break it up and sell it in pieces. David gets angry and respectfully wishes Vivian the best and leaves. Mr. Morse himself wishes Vivian the best too and tells Edward he will tear him apart. Back at the hotel, Vivian thinks the business was good. Vivian comments she however think he likes Mr. Morse. Edward says it's irrelevant if he likes him, saying he tries to not get emotional in deals, and Vivian says she's the equivalent, making sense of that she resembles a robot with a person. She simply makes it happen, and which is the reason she doesn't kiss anybody. Edward says they are fundamentally the same, as the two of them screw individuals For cash he says he will go down the stairs for some time and leaves her late that evening. Vivian calls room administration and asks where Edward endlessly is directed to him. Edward plays piano for the lodging workers and she's dazzled. While hearing him he then requests that them all leave them, which they do, and the two beginning having a private second together. Edward lifts her up on the piano and the two of them begin stroking each other. The next morning Edward gives Vivian his visa to purchase garments, and she says the stores weren't pleasant to her last time. Next Edward follows her to the stores to ensure they are good to her and clarifies for the storekeeper they will burn through a revolting measure of cash in there. The storekeeper becomes euphoric and draws out a few ladies who begin helping Vivian. Out of nowhere Edward gets a call from Philip who says there is an issue and Edward needs to leave. Vivian keeps testing garments and is dealt with like a genuine sovereign, purchasing a ton of garments. While shopping she strolls into the store that was unkind to her last time, saying they committed a major error, and leaves. She returns to the inn and Mr. Thompson gets cheerful seeing her. Vivian is truly gleaming. In the meantime Philip is blissful in light of the fact that they figured out how to purchase Mr. Morse's organization, despite the fact that he would rather not sell it yet. Edward doesn't listen. Philip asks what's up with him this week. Edward then tells Philip he loves to play with building blocks as youthful, commenting they fabricate nothing in the organization, they just obliterate. That night Vivian has arranged an unexpected treat for Edward, just wearing a tie, and next up Vivian gives Edward a treatment shower. The next day they go to a polo matchup and Edward acquaints her with two of his past accomplices who have hitched other rich folks. They tell Vivian everybody is attempting to land Edward, yet Vivian answers she's not attempting to land him but is using him to sleep with him, and leaves them stunned. Later people remark how sweet Vivian is telling it to Edward. Edward and Vivian have fun together, and all the while Philip watches them as Mr. Morse's grandson David, who is playing in the game, stumbles into Vivian. Later Philip inquires about Vivian, thinking she's a spy. Moore's ascent trying to stop Philip from worrying. Edward explains he picked her up on the street and Philip starts laughing. While Edward goes to talk to a senator, Philip walks up to Vivian telling her he knows what she is and asks if they can get together. When Edward leaves, as they get back to the hotel Vivian is upset and becomes angry. He told people who she was without informing her first so she'd be prepared. Edward says he's sorry, but that Philip thought she was some industrial spy, and since Philip has been his attorney for 10 years he thought he could trust him. She says no one has made her feel as cheap as he did today, and says she wants her money so she can get out of there. He picks up the money but she ignores it and leaves anyway, which Edward sees as she waits for the elevator. Edward comes out saying he's sorry that he wasn't prepared to answer questions about them, that it was stupid of him, and adds he doesn't want her to leave. As the elevator arrives Vivian doesn't go in and then tells Edward he hurt her and that she shouldn't do it again, and the two go back inside. That night Vivian tells him about her life and how she met Kit, who worked on the street and made her do it as well, explaining her life is not what she once dreamed it would be. Edward comments she is a very bright and special woman who could be so much more. The next day Edward is leaving early from work for a date and Philip asks if it is with a street worker, and Edward tells him never to call her that again. At the hotel Edward tells Vivian she looks good but that something is missing and shows her a necklace he's borrowed after having asked. She's shocked it's $250,000 in the lobby. All the hotel personnel note how beautiful she looks and are happy for her. The two go to an airport to take a private jet to San Francisco. They go to a fine opera, and Vivian jokingly comments she sees a band on stage. Edward says people's first reaction to opera is dramatic. Either they love for the rest of their life or hate it. The overture starts and Vivian is excited during the performance. Vivian gets captivated and very emotionally involved in the play. Afterwards she is absolutely filled with emotions and loves it. That night Vivian asks Edward if he could skip work tomorrow to do things, and Edward remarks he to zone the company. Next Philip gets informed Edward is taking the day off and is baffled. Vivian and Edward have fun together the whole day doing spontaneous things. That night Edward has fallen asleep on the bed and Vivian slowly gets close to him and starts kissing him. He wakes up and they both just continue kissing each other passionately the next morning. Furthermore, the last day together Edward tells her he's returning to New York yet needs to see her once more. Thus he has organized so she gets her own loft, a decent vehicle, cash to shop with, and different things. However, at that point Vivian blows up recounting to him an account of how her mom secured her in the storage room when she was terrible as youthful, and she had a fantasy how a knight on a white pony would move up and save her from this trap pinnacle. She then, at that point, adds the knight never told her in that fantasy he would place her in an extraordinary condo. Philip calls saying Mr. Morse needs to see him. and Edward says he's coming. Edward then tells Vivian he heard all she said, yet that he isn't prepared to do all the more right. Presently later Kik drops by, and as they meet Kik remarks she was reluctant to embrace her since she could wrinkle her. Vivian advises Pac that Edward needs to see her again, yet that she would rather not. Unit doesn't really accept that her and thinks she has gone gaga for him, and after some silly examining Vivian concedes she's enamored. In the meantime, Edward meets with Mr. Morse, who says he's reconsidered his position but is concerned about all his employees. Philip starts saying it will all be taken care of, but Edward stops him and asks everyone to get out so that he can get to talk to Mr. Morse alone. Once alone, Edward says his interest in his company has changed, saying he doesn't want to sell his company off in pieces anymore, but help him build it. Edward says they can leave the details for the others, and Mr. Morse is very happy and thanks him as Philip gets in, and Mr. Morse tells them all Edward and himself are going to build great ships together. Philip gets shocked. Edward takes a walk in the city, and a while later Philip comes by Edward and Vivian's hotel room, asking for Edward, who's not there. She says Edward will be back soon, and as Philip sits down beside her he starts touching her, grabbing her, and as she fights back he hits her. Vivian screams at him to get off her, and suddenly Edward appears. Philip starts calling Vivian and Edward hits him real hard, yelling at him to get out as he has helped Vivian later. She tells him he made her a really good offer, but she wants more. Edward says the question is how much more, and Vivian replies she wants the fairy tale. Edward gives her the $3,000, thanks her, and says if she ever needs anything, a dental floss or whatever, he'll always answer her call. On her way out, Vivian thanks Mr. Thompson for everything, and he says he hopes to see her again and gets a limousine for her the following day. Vivian has packed her belongings to go to San Francisco to get a job and finish high school, telling Kit she used to get pretty good grades. Her bus leaves in 1 hour, and she gives Kit some of Edward's money, telling her to take care of herself. Edward is pondering as he's about to leave. In the lot, Bobby, Mr. Thompson, gets a limousine for him. Edward asks if he can return the jewelry for him, and Thompson comments enigmatically it must be difficult to let go of something so lovely, and afterward adds Daryl, the limousine escort, likewise drove Miss Vivian home yesterday, and Edward says thanks to him. Kid is seen conversing with somebody as Edward seems purchasing blossoms. Unexpectedly Vivian hears a vehicle horn, and outside Edward shows up on a white limousine hollering Vivian's name. Edward then starts climbing the steps dependent upon her, and keeping in mind that embracing her, he asks what occurred after the night safeguarded her, and she answers she saved him right back, and they begin kissing. The end. Thank you for watching.